That song is a lament, popular type of song in the book of Psalms also. But this guy is lamenting the end of a relationship, and he recognizes his part in that he failed to pay attention to the person he was in this relationship with. He failed to attend to and actually love this other person. And because of that, lost the person. That's really what our passage we're looking at today is going to be talking about. How exactly in marriage do we focus on the other rather than ourselves? So I'd like to ask you, if you would, to stand and let's read together the passage we're going to be looking at today. So if y'all will just stand out of reverence to the Word of God and read with me, we'll all read together 1 Corinthians 7, verses 1 through 6. Now concerning what you wrote, it is good for a man not to touch a woman, but because of sexual immorality, each must have his own wife, and each must have her own husband. The husband must fulfill the duty to the wife, and likewise the wife to the husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, rather the husband does. And likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but rather the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except out of a mutual consent for a time, so that you may be at leisure for prayer, and then come together again, so that the adversary might not tempt you through your lack of self-control. But I say this as a concession, not as a command. Thank you so much. You may be seated. We're continuing through 1 Corinthians, this series of sermons that I have titled, Such Were Some of You. And I think the whole point of this letter is to help people who are relatively young in their faith to fully grasp the many ways in which being in Christ has completely, radically transformed everything about us. We were something else. In Christ now we are something different. And it affects every aspect of our living. And Paul goes through a whole array of topics as he addresses how being in Christ changes everything about these different areas of our lives. And he gets to chapter 5 and starts addressing the problem of sexual immorality. And we've seen in chapter 6 how he addresses a really bad problem. Apparently, in the church in Corinth, there were believers who were still frequenting the temple prostitutes and still using these poor young women who had been conscripted into this life of ritual prostitution at the cultic temples and abusing them and using them for their own selfish sexual desire. And Paul corrects that by telling them that we were not given bodies for sexual immorality. We were not given bodies to exercise sexuality in ways that dishonor our Creator. We were given bodies, in fact, he says, for the Lord. And he talks about the real purpose of our bodies as members in this larger body of Christ. And we are to be affecting the world, using the bodies we've been given, affect the world and everything around us as part of this body of Christ for the purposes of His kingdom. That's why we have bodies, not for a selfish practice of sexuality. So we've talked about that in the previous sermon that I preached. And sometimes we can get the idea that all the Bible has to say about sex is don't do it. And that's not at all the biblical picture. The reason we saw last message, we were talking in chapter 6, the end of chapter 6, is the reason God cares so much about us not abusing our sexuality is that it matters profoundly. When we engage in sexual activity, we are doing something that is profoundly impactful on us as beings created in the very image of God. And there is a bonding and a spiritual union that takes place, whether you want it to or not, in the act of sex. And there are consequences when we misuse that. There are damages and wounds that we bear in our souls when we abuse and misuse that. So the reason God says, no, don't do these things, and the reason he talks about it so much is that it matters profoundly. Sex is not trivial. There's no such thing as casual sex. It's a profound aspect of what it means to be human. That's why God has so much to say about it. But I don't want you to think then that God says, just don't have sex. Which is apparently the way some people have tried to approach this. So I've titled today's message, Sex and Marriage. I kind of think that summarizes the overall topic of these 6 verses. If you're not married, this may be something important for you to learn for your future life. If in the future you come to be married, but rest easy. If today's message isn't directly about your life circumstance right now, we will get in a couple of weeks to a passage where we're dealing with the single life, and then the married people will have to sit through that. So we'll all bear with each other as we talk about all this that we all need to be aware of. But we're talking about sex and marriage. So let's go back then. Verse 1. Now concerning what you wrote, and I think this is a quote from whatever letter he received from the Corinthian church. Now, up until this point in the letter to the Corinthians, Paul has apparently been addressing things that he's heard. People have told him this and this and this is going on, so he's writing about those types of things. But now he comes to a point where he says, okay, you guys wrote me a letter, and you wanted to ask me about this. So he quotes this from their letter. It is good for a man not to touch a woman. Clearly, the Corinthian church was a study in extremes. Just a few verses back, he's telling people, don't go to the prostitutes. And now he's talking to people who are saying, you know, it's better for a man not to touch a woman. And that touch is kind of an ancient Near Eastern euphemism for sex. It's better for a man not to have sex with a woman at all. We kind of have 2 opposite extremes here. One group of people in the church that seems to think, sex doesn't matter, just do whatever you want, have sex with whoever you want to, because really it's the spiritual stuff that matters. What you do with your body, who cares? And that's what we addressed in chapter 6. But now there's obviously way on the far opposite end of the spectrum in the church. There are people who say, no, it's all wicked and evil and bad, and the only way to avoid contamination and the only way to be pure is to just not have sex at all. Just don't have anything to do with it. It's better for a man not to touch a woman, not to have anything to do with sex, period. There has always been there have always been these 2 extremes within the people of God. People who think, let's just do whatever and nothing's going to matter, and misunderstand what the redemption of Christ means. It isn't just canceling your debt, it's also freeing you from the presence and power of sin. So that's where that side errs. But then there's the other side that says the only way to be spiritual is to not touch, not taste, not do anything. The ascetic side of the faith. And this is the group that Paul is addressing here. People who are overzealous. They have decided that, well, you know what? There are so many things we can do wrong when it comes to sex. There's so many ways we can exercise it wrong. Let's just not do it at all. Let's avoid it altogether. So that seems to be the thought of some people in the church, that's the way to deal with sexual sin, is to eradicate sex altogether from our lives. Paul doesn't agree with this extreme either. He doesn't agree with either of those extremes I've been talking about. So he responds, but because of sexual immorality, each must have his own wife, and each must have her own husband. This is the way I've chosen to translate this. Many of your translations may say, let each have his own wife. And the problem I have with translating the third person imperative in the Greek with let is that it sounds like it's allowance, like you're allowing something. The force of this in the Greek is a command. Now, we can't do this in English. We can only issue commands to you. You take out the garbage. You wash the dishes. You know, that's the way we issue a command. You sit down. In the Greek, you can say, he, take out the garbage. She, sit down. They walk the dog. You can issue a command in the third person, and that's the way it's written in the Greek here. So when he says that each, basically he's saying each have his own wife, and each wife have her own husband. He issues it as a command. And again here, this use of the word have is a Greek euphemism for sex. So here's the interesting thing. The ascetic people, the ones who say, you know, the way to avoid problems is just to not do it at all. Paul seems to be saying that's not going to fix the problem. Going to this extreme is not going to solve the problem. In fact, Paul says, because there is such a thing as sexual immorality, because there is so much pressure around us to fall into these things, the way you protect against that is not abstinence, it's marriage. So the way you solve this isn't to try to eradicate this from your life, but it's to actually exercise it in the way God designed it to be exercised. And in fact, he says, no, this seems to indicate that the people who are saying this are applying this to married people and saying, even though you're married, you shouldn't have sex. You're married, but just be done with it. Don't have anything to do with it. And Paul says quite the opposite. No, he commands it. He says, have your own wife. And he flips it. And throughout this whole passage, he does this constantly. He doesn't just say that the husband must have his wife, kind of in the macho sense, you know, a man has needs, that kind of thing. No, he says it right around in the opposite direction too. The wife must have her own husband. This is what God has given us to combat sexual immorality. And that is a sexuality that is exercised rightly as opposed to wrongly. That is the strongest guard against sexual immorality. That is the greatest protection God has provided us against the many temptations to be drawn into an exercise of our sexuality that will be damaging to ourselves and others. I like that Paul chooses this euphemism for sex, have, because it implies ownership. You have something. Implies that it belongs to you. And he's going to spell that out much more forcefully in the verses to come. But what he's saying here is, this is the way we who follow Christ address the issue of sexual immorality. God has given husbands and wives each other to be the guard against that. And when Paul says you have your wife, and when Paul says you have your husband, he literally means they belong to you sexually. Think about it. When you enter into marriage, you have entered into the relationship with the only person God will allow you to exercise your sexuality with. So, in fact, the moment you marry somebody, you are gifting that person with your entire sexuality. You are saying, my sexuality belongs to you now, and nobody else. There is an ownership in marriage. That's the way God designed sex to work. It's not about taking. It's about giving. It's not about using. It's about gifting yourself to another person. And he says, no, the answer is not to say, just burn sex out of your life. The answer is to understand how it's meant to function and let it function the way it is designed to function. You belong to each other. And you have given yourself to your spouse so that you become their protection against all the temptations to do something they shouldn't be doing. The husband must fulfill the duty to the wife. Again, here in the Greek, it's the imperative. Husband, fulfill your duty to your wife. And likewise, the wife to the husband. I think it's interesting that he tells the husband to do this first, because I think a lot of times husbands tend to complain more about their wives in terms of the duty to exercise sexuality, but don't think much about their side of the equation, their side of the duty to fulfill this gift of sexuality to the spouse. But Paul makes it clear that this happens in both directions. And our sexuality binds us to meet the need and what God intends for that other person. The problem with sex in marriage is when we don't see it as, how can I exercise my sexuality in the way that will best help my spouse honor God? When we don't see it that way, when we see it in terms of what I want and what I think I need, and we turn it into a greedy thing, and it becomes about serving myself rather than serving the other, then when you have two people doing that at each other, sex doesn't work. And the sexual connection doesn't work the way God intended it to work. When we enter into marriage, we have gifted each other with our sexuality. And we are duty-bound to meet the need of our partner. Now, I think in marriages too many times we turn that backwards. And we don't think of what my duty is. We think of what my spouse's duty is. I don't think of, am I meeting with my sexuality, am I meeting what my wife needs? Most often, each person is thinking, is my spouse meeting my need? And you may, if you've been married more than a day, you probably come to realize that what each person feels they need from the other varies significantly. Right? What it is that a husband needs and what it is that a wife needs varies significantly. Now, you know what you think you need, but that's not your job. That's not your concern. Your concern is to figure out what your spouse needs and give that to them. Now, as long as all you care about is what you think you need, you are failing in your duty. You are failing to focus your attention on what you've actually been entrusted to do. And the problem many times is husbands don't think enough about what their wife needs. They think a lot about what they think they need, but they don't think about what their wife needs. You see, if I exercise my sexuality to protect my wife from any temptation to fall into sexual sin, then I'm going to care about what she really needs from me. She might need more tenderness than I've been giving. She might need more attention outside of the bedroom than I've been giving. But that is what she needs to be able to easily resist a suitor who tries to swoop in and charm her off her feet. It's easy for somebody outside of the home to just spend a few minutes with your spouse a day and laugh at jokes and seem really witty and all this. It's easy to do that. So my job is to supply my spouse with everything she needs so that if she ever encounters an idiot out there that's trying to do something like that, it'll be easy for her to say, I'm not interested. I'm taken care of. It is my duty as husband to figure out what my wife needs to feel loved and secure and treasured. And everything sexually that I bring to the table is meant to be spent toward that end. It's the same with my wife. Her job is not to sit home and think, what do I need my husband to do for me? Her job is to think, what does my husband need? How do I figure out what he needs? And how do I make it easy for him to turn down other alternatives out there? When we both do this, when we understand that our sexuality is both a gift and a duty, then it begins to become something powerful. There's a joy you never know until you've gone 20, 30, 40 years into this, in what it means to keep discovering what your spouse needs from you. I forget who it was, Gary Thomas maybe, in a conference on marriage, talked about how marriage isn't like a Tonka truck, you know, these things that they're basically indestructible and you roll them, but, you know, there's only so much you can do with a Tonka truck. No, marriage is more like a set of Legos. You're constantly reconfiguring things. You're constantly remaking things. You're constantly figuring each other out. As we grow, our lives change and the challenges we face change. And doing that together with another person that's committed themselves until death takes me away from you, I have given myself to you. That is what God intended. I will figure it out. You may be surprised to know that the Bible describes failure to provide sexual intimacy as grounds for divorce. Now, many times we focus on just a verse or two, and there is a passage in the Gospels where Jesus is being asked about a popular rabbinic interpretation of his day, which was the any cause divorce. And basically there was a rabbi by the name of Hillel who understood the command when Moses writes in Deuteronomy and says, if you find any cause of shameful things in your spouse, then you must write her a letter of divorce, which is basically an authorization to be released from this marriage so that she can remarry another. The rabbis had focused on that any cause part and ignored the shamefulness or the that part of it, and just said any cause means any cause. So they said, you know, you can divorce your wife if she burns your toast. Literally, Hillel said that. So when they asked Jesus, what do you think about this? Moses said we can divorce our wives for any cause, and Jesus corrects a misunderstanding of that passage. He says, no. He was talking about that, you know, any cause of something shameful, what he was talking about was adultery. That's what Moses was addressing in that passage. But what we don't recognize is that that's not the only passage in the Bible that addresses issues that may destroy a marriage. And there is an interesting passage, and for years I had overlooked it. It was brought to my attention by an author by the name of David Enstone Brewer. And it's in Exodus 21. And basically, what we have here is a description of a very specific circumstance. A woman who is a slave and is purchased, but is purchased not to be a slave in the household, but actually is purchased and then taken as a wife. And basically the point Moses has to make about this is that that person, when she enters in as a wife, is no longer a slave. If you mess up that marriage and you divorce her, she does not go back to being your slave. She goes free. That's basically the force of it. But notice the things that Moses describes here in Exodus 21, 10 and 11, that are three grounds for divorce. He shall not diminish her food, her clothing, or her marital rights. And if he does not do these three things for her, she shall go out for nothing, without payment of money. Now, obviously, the rabbis in Jesus' day, and I think Paul would have agreed with this, given his writings on the subject. The rabbis in his day believed that if this applies to a woman who used to be a slave, surely it applies to a woman who entered marriage as a free person. And basically, these are three areas of neglect: food, clothing, and intimacy. God designed us for this, and to deny another person this is to fail in our duty that we have agreed to when we entered into the marriage. Paul is trying to flesh this out more. The wife does not have authority over her own body. Rather, the husband does. And maybe at this point, the people listening are thinking, okay, maybe Paul's finally figured it out that he's not being as radical as I kind of think he's being. He keeps kind of flipping it back and forth, but he is reminding wives that their bodies belong to their husbands, and that would have been an accepted thing. That would have been just the way everybody saw it. The husband, the father of the house, owned everybody in the house. In fact, under Roman law, the pater familias, the father of the house, had the right of life and death over everybody else in the house. He could kill any of them. Wife, children, slaves. He had that level of authority. So clearly their understanding would have been, yeah, of course, a wife belongs to her husband. The husband owns her. But then Paul says something that I'm sure was absolutely shocking to them. And likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body. Rather, the wife does. This is the nature of marriage. When you enter into marriage, you have handed over your entire sexuality to this other person. You have given it to them as a gift. It is theirs and nobody else's. It is not yours. It is your spouse's. In fact, you have surrendered willingly authority over your own body to this other person. And we do this mutually. This flies in the face of what our culture tries to tell us today. The debate about abortion has centered on this issue in our culture. Who has authority over your body? And what our culture has decided is that you alone have authority over your body. Even a child in your womb has no right except the rights you choose to give them, because it's your body to do with as you please. That's where our culture has come down on this. And we think of this as a very important right. What Paul is trying to tell us is that marriage is about giving that right up. You have given your body to this other person, and they have done the same thing to you. Think of the awe and the gratitude with which this gift must be received. That somebody else has entrusted you with their entire sexuality and their whole body. They've said, I am giving myself to you. I belong to you. To receive such a gift should inspire in us a sense of profound gratitude and unworthiness. But that is the way God designed marriage to work. It is about surrender. We give ourselves to each other. I don't own my body. My wife does. I joke about it. You know, my wife said, oh, leave your beard. Oh, I left my beard. But I'm dead serious. If my wife says I don't want the beard, it's gone. I mean it. Because I'm here for her. I belong to her. We give ourselves to each other, and we think of our bodies not as a right, not as something I am the despot of, but as something that I have given as a gift to this other person. Can you begin to understand how radically different our sexuality becomes when that's the way we think about it? Do not deprive one another. Don't leave your spouse starved for affection. If you're arguing about something, if your spouse has done something wrong, don't use sex as a way of punishing. Don't use it as the way to win an argument. Don't abuse it that way. Don't deprive each other of the affection you promised when you entered into this marriage. Don't withhold. And if you're tempted to do that, you need to work that out. You need to figure out what's going on, and you need to get it right, because you are this person's only sexual partner, period. They handed you all the keys. They gave you their entire sexuality when they entered into this. You don't abuse that. You don't use it for selfish means. Do not deprive one another. And this means, husbands, that you have to figure out what your wife needs from you. Don't deprive her of the affection she needs, of whatever it is that she needs. And wives likewise. Don't deprive your husbands. Finally, Paul is going to give a bit of an allowance to the ascetics in the congregation, the people who just really want to not have sex, even though they're married. He says, don't deprive one another except out of a mutual consent for a time, so that you may be at leisure for prayer, and then come together again, so that the adversary might not tempt you through your lack of self-control. But I say this as a concession, not as a command. What do we make of all this? Well, there are a lot of qualifying bits in this that Paul is saying here. But here's what Paul's suggesting. Okay, maybe some of you just really feel like you need to do something, not have sex as some kind of spiritual discipline or something. He says, okay, I will tell you a situation in which you could refrain from having sex. And that is if you both agree for a limited, specified time, for the purpose of providing some leisure or some open space for prayer, but then you've got to end that and come back together. Because if you don't, you are leaving a door open for the adversary. Now here's the thing about this. Sometimes the problem with the ascetic approach to the Christian faith is, if you think that denying your body is the way forward, the way to holiness is to just not let yourself enjoy anything that feels good, if you think that's the way you're best going to stay pure and holy, you will realize the harder you try to do that, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, you will be hit by temptations and you will fall flat on your face. Because depriving ourselves is not the way God intended for us to do this. He intended for us to actually exercise what He gave us in the right way. That's the way you face it. So this is the irony. You try to be all spiritual and say, we're going to mutually agree not to have sex so that we can pray and seek God, and you find that when you think you're at the highest point, all of a sudden you have this catastrophic failure. Well, it's because you didn't do things the way God told you to. And sometimes when we build this spiritual pride approach to our walk with Christ that's based on our own strength and merit, we open the floodgates for the adversary to come in and mess us up. Paul says, don't be foolish about this. Don't leave doors open for the adversary. And he says, I say this as a concession, not as a command. So this is what I make of it. If you're just one of these people who feels bad every time you enjoy yourself, and you have to do some of this, and if you happen to be married to somebody who happens to be the same way, then you have this option. You can mutually agree to refrain from sex for a specified time, but you can't do it as an ongoing practice in your marriage. Now, if this isn't you, then don't do it at all. If you feel no desire to practice this, don't do it. You don't have to. This is not a spiritual discipline we all have to incorporate into our married life. This is a concession to the people who are on the far end, who feel the absolute need to do this. But notice how even the way he words it, he says, for a time so that you may be at leisure for prayer. Now, for an ascetic, that's not the word you would use. What do you mean leisure for prayer? We're talking about disciplines. You have sweat and blood and suffering for Christ. That kind of, and he uses this. It's the idea of something open and a wide open spaces, leisure for prayer. He's reminding them the whole point, if you want to do this, is to enjoy God, not to be miserable for God. But if that's where you both are, then okay, it's fine to say let's enjoy God for a moment here, and we'll go right back to the regular living of life. But let's provide a space here for just to enjoy God a bit. That's fine if you want to do that. Marriage is a profound mystery. Paul has a lot to say about it, and he compares it to such high things, to the relationship between Christ and his church. There's something profound about marriage, something spiritual and deep, and something unique about it. It's this exclusive relationship, and you enter into it, and it's its own world. It's two people who have never before been this, becoming one thing that has never existed before, and figuring each other out and giving yourselves to each other. That's the whole lifeblood of marriage. And sex is given to us as a spiritually bonding physical act by which we give ourselves to each other. That's what sex is meant to be. It's not recreational. I'm not saying you don't enjoy it. I'm just saying it's profound enjoyment, not superficial. And it's about giving, not taking. And it's about meeting needs, not having them met. If we do it this way, we begin to discover why God created us capable of engaging in sex. Now, what I've described to you looks nothing like what our culture tells us to do with sex. Here's what I want to suggest to you. Look around you for a moment at the end result of our culture's advice. Look at the many marriages that are failed, the many adulteries that take place, the many broken hearts and destroyed relationships. And let's not talk about the fact that our society has more STDs today than ever in the past. We have hit new marks when it comes to STDs, sexually transmitted diseases. Yeah, those are the joys of exercising sex the way our culture tells us to. I just want to tell you, that's not the only way to do it. There is a different way. And if we come to Christ and we surrender our lives to Him and His purposes, and sex becomes about me guarding my spouse so that they are free to fully exercise everything God intends for them in His kingdom. And I've given everything I have to this. And my spouse has done the same for me. There is a strength there. And there is a courage. And there is a blessing of God on that union that changes the world around them. That's what I want to invite you to enjoy and participate in. And if you're not married, I want you to think of how important this is. And I want you to save yourself for that moment, so that you don't drag into your marriage a whole bunch of regrets and a whole bunch of shame and a whole bunch of things your spouse is going to have to forgive you for. If you're young, it's worth waiting. It's that good. It's that important. It's that sacred. And if you're married, do it right. Don't buy into the world's version of marriage, some kind of a mutual agreement where we do 50-50. I'll do my half if you do your half. No. It's 100-100. You give it all. If you're married, I want to challenge you to fully live it the way Christ is calling us to. And to allow sexuality to become what it needs to be. This may mean for some of you that you need to start having some honest conversations. What do you need from me? How can I love you right? And sometimes we're embarrassed. Don't be embarrassed. God designed us to do this for each other. Be honest and open. And stop demanding rights. And start fulfilling duties. We're going to sing a song of invitation. as we're singing, whatever it is God may be putting on your heart this morning. If you're unmarried and you want to come forward today and say, Jesus, I want to commit to you that I'm going to remain pure until my wedding day. I'm going to save this for your honor. And I'm going to use everything I've got to serve this future spouse. If you're willing to make that commitment today, I want you to come forward and I want you to pray with somebody about that. Do something that puts a marker down. Involve somebody else with you in it. Let someone pray with you about it. Maybe you're married and you just need to recommit yourself to the way you need to be living your life for your spouse. If that's you, come while we sing. Let's all stand. I'd like to ask Steve and Patty, if you would, help me with the invitation. And David and Kim, could you help me? Skaggs, please come while we sing.